Tonight's theme is the second precept of the 5 precepts of Buddhism. Last week we did non-killing, non-harming, or ahimsa. And tonight's precept is often called non-stealing, which may seem intuitive to some of us anyway. I have a feeling there aren't very many thieves on our calls, although you never know. And if you are a thief, you might have a really good reason for it, because you're all lovely people. But that's not the point. The point is not literally stealing. Of course, non-stealing. But as all of these precepts do, they are pointing to something deeper. They're pointing us below the surface of the obvious. Yeah. After all, we are asked to follow these restraints, right? These 5 precepts are seen to be restraints, yeah? And not moral, good, bad kinds of judgment restraints, but simply restraints because we understand cause and effect, and we are prizing a path upon which we can remain. So part of the restraints there is to know the cause and effect of that which knocks us off the path. And as much as the precepts are seen to be sort of absolute, right? Never kill, right? Thou shalt not kill, if you will. There is some room here for conscience and context. So we don't have to think of these necessarily as absolute precepts, but rather skillful means, right? Ways to perceive our lives on a path. And so in that sense, for lay people anyway, we're being asked to use really discerning wisdom and discerning judgment. And ultimately, it has to do with motivation. It has to do with knowing our deepest intention. So that's sort of a caveat to some of the principles for lay people. Now, for monastics, it's an entirely different story. So, for example, celibacy is a big priority for monastics. But for lay people, and this will be next week's theme, it's not so much about maintaining celibacy as much as it is restraining from any kind of misconduct, any kind of sexual misconduct. And that there is skillful means also in our relationships, intimate lives. So this is what I mean by context matters for these precepts. Now, that said, again, this is not an excuse just to go off the deep end with these things, but rather to take them seriously as vows to the path itself. So the other thing is to recognize how mindfulness actually helps us to deepen each of these precepts. So last week we did a meditation on non-harming, and honestly, I don't remember what we did, but it was around the cultivation of gentleness, gentle awareness, and proceeding lightly with our awareness, first within ourselves and then out into the world. And that has a way of changing kind of how we relate to our surroundings. And the same thing is true with this theme of non-stealing. Really, this precept is often translated as not taking what is not freely offered. And in many ways, it's a path of renunciation. And yet, for those of us who are in the world, living lives where we need paychecks, and we need to think in terms of vocation and stability and sustainability in our lives. I mean, we have all these priorities since we're not being supported by a vihara or a monastery or a community necessarily. And so here, renunciation really, we can get caught up kind of in the paradox and some of the conflict that we feel around what these precepts are asking of us. So I have a few thoughts about this, and then we'll go into some practice, but I'm also curious I'd love to hear what you all have to say about this particular one. And just to clarify this precept a bit, in the Pali Canon, in the Buddhist sutras, in the Buddhist teachings, there's a lot about the precepts. There's a code of conduct for monastics called the Vinaya, and sometimes they cover, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, they will cover code of conduct for lay ordained people. So you can actually get ordained temporarily as a layperson in a monastic environment. So people in traditional cultures might go into a monastery for a while, even though they remain a layperson. It's what we call lay ordination. But you observe all the monastic precepts while you're there. Yeah. This precept really is about paying attention to the impulses, to perhaps either, and this is in the Buddhist teachings, our tendencies towards stinginess, yeah, a lack of generosity. And we're not talking just about material things, but we're talking about a spirit of generosity. After all, stinginess has a root in some other state, yeah. Or wasteful spending, yeah, squandering the value of what you have. So wasteful spending, as I do when I bought a $7 latte the other day. It felt like a waste when I could have easily made it at home. Yeah, those things are getting expensive here in Boston anyway. And also looking at abstaining from deceit to make money, as well as exploitation of others for one's own benefit. And doing things for your livelihood that are at the expense of others. Really, part of this is, according to the Buddha, really about the community, having a fair and a balanced community. And that is maintaining a level of social peace and satisfaction. Basically, that everyone is entitled to well-being. And the impulse to take what's not freely offered or to steal is really that which disrupts the harmony between people in a community. So you can imagine what that means for our society, right? Fraud is also mentioned. So not engaging in fraud. Or, this is an interesting one, not trying to sell people something they don't need. Apparently this was a problem. Oh. So, and again, I imagine this is all taking place in the Sangha, right, in the Buddhist Sangha, so that if you have somebody there, or even a layperson who's trying to sell something to the other folks in the community, if they say they don't need it, leave them alone. Don't bombard them with ads and billboards and all this stuff. Anyway, it's right there in the canon. Also, there is sort of a warning about gambling, which apparently was a problem as well. So gambling is very much sort of the road to ruin in many ways, even then. And as mentioned, gambling is not advisable. Now, I don't know what he would say about the lottery, but who knows? That's, again, the Buddha's not saying don't play the lottery, but be careful if you do, and monitor your expectations and your attachments to the outcome. You may be, see, so here, this is a good example of intention. What if you were playing the lottery not to win it, but to pay into somebody less fortunate than you who might win it, and to support them through empathetic joy? See, there, playing the lottery is not a problem, because your intention is altruistic. It's there to support whoever might win it. Now, it's a gamble, which we're not supposed to do, because you don't know who's going to win it. So, not that that maybe matters. And then the final thing is to abstain from bribery. I wonder how that would sit in Washington with all the lobbyists that are there and our politicians. That is a breaking of the precept. Yeah. Um, and of course, some lobbies there may be some that you're fully in support of, as there are some that I'm in support of too. But it's just interesting to kind of look and see how even in the Buddhist time, here it's not just about non-stealing as an obvious breach of ethical code, right? But it has these various contours, all of which can lead us down the path into one of the three poisons that we call greed. So Buddhism has these three poisons: hatred, greed, and delusion. And it's interesting to consider these precepts as instituted to keep us from falling into the snare of these things. Yeah. And so greed, as I was sort of considering with this precept, to me it was very clear that this was the poison that is being sort of targeted here. After all, what is it about stinginess, wasteful spending? Greed here isn't necessarily perhaps greed for money, but greed, I want to have that no matter what the cost. There was one other thing too. Scarcity. This one is not mentioned in the text, but it came up for me, sort of looking at my own history. And maybe some of you have this as well. Renunciation has been an amazing antidote to living with a sense of scarcity, feeling like you never quite have enough, even if your intentions are good. So I don't know how many of you have been caught in this. This is, it can be a narrative. Yeah, it can be sort of an underlying feeling state that we may not even be conscious of. And it is a suffering state, largely rooted in fear. So now all of a sudden, we're not just sort of, you should steal, but the cause and effect here is asking us, or the awareness of cause and effect is asking us to look deeply into fear, lack of trust that will be taken care of, and a need to just keep acquiring and having more out of the sense of fear, of need, and of greed. So we might even say, ultimately, I don't know what you think about this, but that this precept is really addressing what ultimately is a fear-based tendency. And that hopefully can help bring some compassion for those who are struggling with this precept, because that too is an important part of this. We can take these precepts and direct the lens inward and, oh, this is me on the path and addressing kind of my own pitfalls. But hopefully understanding these deeper layers of what these precepts are speaking to can help us to have more compassion for others who are stuck with these precepts, and not to be in a state of utter judgment and reproach of people who are. So what do we mean by renunciation? So part of the practice with this second precept is cultivating, as I mentioned a moment ago, generosity, the sense of generosity, which is the very first of the perfections, 6 perfections that we find in Mahayana Buddhism. Dana, or generosity. Spirit of generosity really is what it's about. And renunciation. These are both also discussed in the Dhammapada, generosity and renunciation. And trust, and I would add trust in there. And here it's really sort of, despite whatever scarcity in the past I may have experienced, I find myself still here. I'm able to survive. I'm sustainable. Things are okay. And it's perfectly fine because I see the blessings that I have had in my life. When it comes to asking for donations, even for our Sunday night group, it just doesn't matter to me. I have no interest in saying, hey, if you want to donate for the Sunday nights, I don't have that need because I am actually blessed in my life. Yeah. Now, for some people, it's really important. Some people who maybe haven't been, and no judgment there. I think donations are a great way to go, rather than saying, here's a fixed price that we want people to pay to join our group or to do programs or day retreats. There's always just a donation, whatever you can manage. Yeah. So I'm lucky in that way. And anyway, I think part of the renunciation part here is you're not ignoring your needs. You have to obviously balance out what your needs are. But here's the key. Here's the key for me anyway with this precept has been not seeing what I receive as being wholly mine, but rather it allows me to continue to be in service. This is the game changer on the path, and also helpful with scarcity, with the sense of not having enough or greed, is that I come back to the path itself. That whatever I receive, I put back into the path. Whether it's teaching or practicing or the music or whatever it might be. Largely, that's the practice of renunciation within the heart. After all, we want these precepts, we want to see how these precepts feel right at the heart of the matter. Not just, oh, it's a good idea or I understand it intellectually, but how does each precept feel in the heart? How does it change our experience of these precepts so that it's experiential? And this is where change begins to really sort of over time help enhance the life. And as we read in these two readings at the beginning, what arises from this is, in fact, an ever-increasing fragrance of freedom in our lives. That renunciation, it doesn't mean I'm going to just shake off all the responsibilities and, forego paycheck. I mean, maybe it does for some. I know some people who've retired early and are just meditating full time and they can do it, and that's great. But really, it's about seeing what you're doing as service. Yeah, it's about seeing your path in service of easing suffering through the spirit of altruism. And when that becomes our motivation, and when that becomes sort of the reason why we're asking for sustainability, it can be a game changer. The trust begins to increase a bit, and renunciation takes on kind of a different flavor. Yeah, it's not an all or nothing sum game, but it's a deep kind of motivational, aspirational quality that I'm on this path, and if I am supported on it, then I'm recognizing the interdependence that allows me to be in service of others. In other words, I am one jewel on the jeweled net of interdependence. So you see how we go from non-stealing to actually deepening our understanding of the precept. And the Buddha wanted us to be free. To be free. This ultimately was the goal for really all the teachings, was a matter of liberation and freedom. So the precepts also taken in this way too. Again, not as moral judgments. And concerning livelihood, this is also on the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. Right livelihood early on matters. So, for example, last week we talked about in the tradition of these precepts that if one makes a living, let's say in the trade of killing or butchering meat, that kind of thing, there is seemed to be sort of a possible breaking of the precept. Now, a lot of Buddhists eat meat, so this is what I mean by conscience, and we have to do what we need to do out of discernment. And so too with this precept. If our job is to work for a company that we know is deceiving its customers, we've got a bit of a problem there, right? Because we're part of a system that is breaking the precept, and yet we may not be able to quit or leave. So here, the key here might be to, instead of sort of touting the virtues of the company, which I doubt many of us would do anyway if we do see it as unethical, is not to go into the opposite, which would be avoiding or denial, but to stand clearly in the midst of it and go, I see this, I can't change it right now, and it is what it is until things begin to manifest in a different direction. We can actually cultivate a life that honors all of the precepts over time. Yeah. Again, that's why the intention matters on the path. And panic is not something in service of the precepts. So we can be intentional, recognize our motivation and the good heart of who we are. And just begin to also practice patience, which is the second of the perfections. So it's okay. Yeah. And, there's a Greek term, eudaimonia, which we've talked about in our extension school class a few times, which is the view that we live the lay life, or we live kind of the life of ordinary, everyday, mundane living, all in pursuit and for the support of the spiritual practice. That we actually get more out of what we bring to the world than what we get from it. Yeah, that becomes the ideal. That it's not a stimulus-driven pleasure life anymore, but the good life equals a life of flourishing because we are giving through compassion to others. We are part of the community in a valuable and a meaningful way, as opposed to hedonia, which is just taking and taking just because we're looking for that next sort of pleasure, that next distraction that makes us feel alive. But in the Buddhist world, that is the road sort of off the path. It doesn't mean we don't enjoy things, or we don't enjoy a really good piece of chocolate and a good horror movie. Well, some of you maybe do. I don't particularly like horror films, but you know what I'm saying, that there's nothing wrong with those things. But ultimately, they're all part of a larger path, which is seeking integration and bringing fulfillment, flourishing into the world, rather than taking more things from it. Yeah.